It's 2020. The campaign is here, and the return and the rise of pseudo-woke politics is in full effect. And I want to table a couple of things before we broaden the conversation. I want to just note first, I personally support reparations. And I think the way you support reparations is you support H.R. 40, which is the bill that establishes that process. And by the way, it's a very hard and complicated process, and those who oppose reparations should not be automatically excised out of the debate. It's a legitimate debate. There was a book by Bill Fletcher Jr. and Adolph Reed, both major influences on me and this show, where they debated just that. I happen to support it. And I think that there needs to be a whole series of not only financial restitutions, but also truth and reconciliation commissions across a whole variety of areas in American history, and most certainly reparations. And I also know that H.R. 40 is the bill that provides for reparations. I believe Tulsi Gabbard is a co-sponsor of that bill. No other candidate supports reparations. Can Bernie Sanders' question and answers improve on this issue? Absolutely. Can he go to a point where he supports reparations? Well, I hope he does, and I'll advocate for that. He may not. And the dialectic here is balancing that legitimate critique and legitimate argument by people like my friend Benjamin Dixon, who just did a very smart video about this on his show. I haven't been able to finish all of it, but I would recommend people watch that. It's a valid, grounded, and important critique of Bernie Sanders from a supporter who has a valid critique. At the same time, I am not going to for a second allow for the kind of bullshit, disingenuous, performative politics to be marshaled to undermine Bernie Sanders and also any type of broader radical social democratic project. And I'm certainly not going to allow it from Julian Castro, who has one of the worst records in United States politics. His record as head of HUD was a wealth-eliminating, racial gap-expanding nightmare, which caused progressive groups to organize in anticipation of Hillary Clinton potentially picking him as VP. Here he is taking a dishonest shot at Bernie Sanders on CNN, a shot that the Sanders campaign is going to need to figure out how to close the opening on, no doubt, but nonetheless, a profoundly disingenuous bullshit one.
So what do you mean? Do you think that there should be actual monetary payments to descendants of slaves? Do you support more like what Senator Sanders is talking about, policies such as child care and education that help those who are disadvantaged?
Well, you know, what I said was that that I've long believed that this country should address slavery, the original sin of slavery, including by looking at reparations. And if I'm president, then I'm going to appoint a commission or task force to determine the best way to do that. There's a tremendous amount of disagreement on how we would do that. But let me just say something about Senator Sanders' response there, because he was also asked this question in 2016. Mm-hmm. What he said on The View, I think, the other day was that he didn't think the best way to address this was for the United States to write a check. To my mind, that may or may not be the best way to address it. However, it's interesting to me that when it comes to Medicare for all, health care, you know, the response there has been, we need to write a big check. That when it comes to tuition-free or debt-free college, the answer has been, we need to write a big check. And so if the issue is compensating the descendants of slaves, I don't think that the argument about writing a big check ought to be the argument that you make if you're making an argument that a big check needs to be written for a whole bunch of other stuff.
So Julian Castro, the only reason he should be talked about in this campaign is anything other than an asterisk, is the fact that through this bullshit, disingenuous argument, he is undermining both reparations and the vital universal programs we need. Because, by the way, Medicare for all and free college is not, quote unquote, writing a check. That is the most AM talk radio way of discussing social investment and universal programs I've ever heard. And that includes hearing a lot of terrible talking points from Republicans and right-wing Democrats. Those are creating new programs and redistributing resources in a systemic and sustained way. That's not a check. In fact, reparations would almost certainly involve direct cash transfers, and that is a different thing. So what he's doing there is undermining both efforts in a cynical, craven, pathetic display. And he's so cynical that he's using reparations that he supports. I mean, he's literally retracting his support even as he mouths support for it at the same time. And he's doing it as really a way to make a cheap shot at Bernie Sanders and undermine the vital efforts of things like Medicare for all, free college, a Green New Deal, and all of the other crises that we must address. There is no dichotomy, and this goes toward the bullshit attacks from Julian Castro, and it goes for those who support Bernie Sanders. There's no dichotomy between democratic socialism and addressing and making right materially, psychologically, and culturally America's history and ongoing reality. Because here's the difference. You cannot make an argument that the policies supported for Bernie are bad for people of color. You can make an argument absolutely against his position on reparations, but you cannot make an argument that his broader plan is bad for any type of community that is historically abused in America's various hierarchies of domination and abuse. And in fact, again, I will not make the false equivalency that people like Julian Castro, but also to some degree Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren have made, and President Obama made when he rejected reparations. Universal programs are different than reparations. They're distinct fights. 100%. And those on the left who say that we'll cover reparations with those universal programs, that's a false argument. But those are the exact arguments that are being marshaled by center-right candidates who don't support serious universal programs and are lying about their positions on reparations. The full cynical deployment to the max. And we also know in reality that, in fact, yes, if you implemented Bernie's program, it would, among other things, be a massive transfer of wealth across the board, including racially because of historical concentration of wealth and power in this country. Again, I'm not going to embrace the pseudo-woke and lie and say that that's reparations. It's not. But it is vital, essential policy. And it is a distinct track from reparations. Now, and it's important that we don't fall into the trap of allowing these things to be in opposition to each other. There is a critique of capitalism, there's a historicization of America's experience, and they're absolutely part and connected and can be synthesized, and Bernie should synthesize them. And he can improve and needs to improve his answers on reparations. That's my hope, regardless of his political calculations. Cornel West, who to me just maintains his position as America's most important public intellectual, cut through some of this in a recent interview with Mehdi Hassan, and this here he is speaking specifically on the reparations issue.
On this issue of reparations.
Do you think you can get him to move on reparations? Because he obviously was asked on ABC's The View about whether he backed it. And he said, well, you know, we've got crises in our communities and there's other better ways to address that than by, quote, just writing out a check. And a lot of people criticized him for that, as you say. Do you think he can move on that like he's moved on other issues? That people like you might persuade him into a different position?
There's no doubt about that. But the core is ensuring that there's a fundamental transformation in the racist system under which we live so that the lives of black and brown and yellow peoples are much better. And that's the real issue. And so it seems to me I don't want reparations to be an issue that gets us away from him taking a stand on those issues so much better than any other of the other candidates.
Now, obviously, not only is reparations, which is far more complicated because it's a serious issue that's raised by people of good faith and then deployed by a bunch of cynics like Julian Castro and others, but there's also the old white man line that the pseudo-woke punditocracy marshals against Bernie. And this is, in fact, if you want to be blunt about it, actually hugely anti-Semitic, frankly. And I'm not one to go to that lane. But let's be real. This is a person whose father fled Poland when he was only 17 years old, who had close family members die in the Holocaust, and whose life trajectory and praxis, in the proper use of that word, is antithetical to what that terminology connotes. We're going to play briefly this Bernie Sanders ad to underline that, some of this.
We launched this campaign for president. You deserve to know where I came from, because family history obviously heavily influences the values that we develop as adults. I was born literally a few miles away from here on East 26th Street in Kings Highway. My family and I lived in a 3.5-room rent-controlled apartment. My father was a paint salesman who worked hard his entire life but never made much money. My mother raised my brother and me. I learned a great deal about immigration as a child because my father came from Poland at the age of 17 without a nickel in his pocket, without knowing one word of English. He came to the United States to escape the crushing poverty that existed in his community and to escape widespread anti-Semitism. And it was a good thing that he came to this country, because virtually his entire family was wiped out by Hitler and Nazi barbarism. I am not going to tell you that I grew up in a home of desperate poverty. That would not be true. But what I will tell you is that coming from a lower middle-class family, I will never forget about how money, or really lack of money, was always a point of stress in our family. My mother's dream was that someday our family would move out of that rent-controlled apartment to a home of our own. That dream was never fulfilled. She died young while we still lived in that rent-controlled apartment. My experience as a child living in a family that struggled economically powerfully influenced my life and my values. I know where I came from.
Instead of engaging with this history, the pseudo-woke looks to catch him missing new phrases and buzzwords. Much of the woke language is an attempt to differentiate an in-crowd versus an out-crowd, not by their actions or by beliefs, but by their knowledge of certain buzzwords and terms. And politicians can learn these buzzwords and terms and use it to mask their histories of abuse and regressive policies and to do a faux, fake progressive move. It's a tactic, not a principle. There's a big difference between knowing what you were supposed to say and actually having the courage to do what we all must do and working through all of our flaws and imperfections. This is one of the reasons why this is so disgusting and toxic, because it fuses some of the worst and most unfortunate tendencies, even amongst people who actually have the right aims, with some of the most cynical actors and empty suits on the planet, like Julian Castro. Here's Cornel West again on the difference between knowing buzzwords and showing up.
What do you say to those liberal critics as someone who has been writing and thinking about race and racism your whole life and yet is a Bernie supporter?
Well, one, it's a matter of his heart. He's an anti-racist in his heart. Two, he's old school. He's like me. He doesn't know the buzzwords. He doesn't endorse reparations one moment, in the last 30 years silent on it. He has a consistency over the years, decade after decade, and therefore it's true in his language, in his rhetoric. There are times in which he doesn't say the right thing. He doesn't use the same kind of buzzwords. But when it comes to his fight against racism, going to jail in Chicago as a younger brother,
yes,
and he would go to jail again. He and I would go to jail together again. In terms of fighting against police brutality. So in that sense, I would just tell my brothers and sisters, but especially my chocolate ones, that they shouldn't be blinded by certain kinds of words they're looking for, that in the end, he is a long-distance runner in the struggle against white supremacy.
The pseudo-woke is nothing new. The recent attacks against Bernie are reminiscent of the tactics that bourgeoisie commentators and politicians have used for years to disrupt the left. This is what Mark Fisher described in Exiting the Vampire Castle. The goal is to disrupt any broader formation of class politics and replace it with buzzwords, empty gestures, emotional toxicity, and moralizing. He said, amongst other things, talking about hardworking families identifying their own narrowly defined interests instead of the interests of a broader class. But why would capital be concerned about the left that replaces class politics with moralizing individualism and, far from building solidarity, spreads fear, and insecurity. Our opponents prefer a left that's unwilling to address the structural causes of racism, sexism, and homophobia. They prefer to focus on policing individualistic statements instead of attacking structures as a whole. Unlike the good faith people attacking Bernie from the left and the dynamic arguments from reparations for leading lights like Bill Fletcher Jr., the pseudo-woke is committed to nothing but posturing and power, and will use everything in its disposal to undermine radicalism of every single category. We cannot let this chimera derail a mass, diverse, working-class movement that knows its true enemy is not each other, but the 1% in every single form. All right, guys. And please listen to that whole Cornel West interview with Mehdi Hasan. It's just indispensable. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.